Hello, everyone. Mr. Vona here. First of all, hello. Secondly, welcome to this presentation. And thirdly, I have good news for you and I have bad news for you. Bad news first, we're going to be covering some material that you're going to have to use for your senior research paper. Ooh. Good news, though. Literary theory and most of the stuff that we're going to be talking about on this presentation, it's stuff that you kind of know already. We can call it by a fancy name. We can call it literary theory, and that makes it sound like really out there and really hard. But what really we're talking about when we're talking about literary theory are like ways to look at a work of literature so that you're not talking about like everything. You're talking about like one narrowed focus, one thing that makes sense to you in a work of literature that you want to limit your approach to. Okay, so let me just kind of go through what this actually means. Like I said, literary theory is a method of studying a work of literature. It's a focal point, something for you to kind of fixate on, so that, you know, if you've ever written a paper and maybe this is a real stretch, but like maybe you've procrastinated and you have no idea what you actually want to say in this essay. And, you know, you're sitting down in front of your laptop and you're like, where to start? Where do you begin? What do I even talk about? I have no idea what I even want to talk about. So you try writing about everything and like you're finding that you can actually say nothing. Nothing is coming to you. Literary theory is first and foremost a way for you to understand like how to create your own question for studying a work of literature. So it provides for you a framework. This is a research paper. A research paper means that you're going to be reading through a lot of other people's work and commentary on the piece of literature that you've decided to read. There's a ton of research out there, tons of it. And if you were trying to sort through all of it without having some kind of limited focus, you're going to find that you're going to be reading things forever. And that would really freak you out. So what this will provide you is kind of like a focal point here, so that like instead of reading every single thing that's ever been written about that work of literature, you're instead going to be reading stuff that's on this one subject, this one narrow, limited subject. So it's a way for you to focus your attention. It's a way for you to define certain kinds of terms. Sometimes terms in one kind of literary theory mean one thing, and in another kind of literary theory, they mean something slightly different. You'll notice probably, though, that a lot of literary theories fixate on and talk about a lot of the same stuff. A lot of the same things come up. So understanding the terminology that goes into them will help you better understand what it is that you want to say yourself in your own work of literature. I don't know, by the way, if you can see through my weird little circular window or not. If not, I'm going to upload this entire presentation onto Google Classroom so that you can read it on your own. So if I'm blocking anything you can't see, just know that it'll be there. What you're trying to do for your research paper is a deep reading of the work of literature. So rather than give me like a book report, like what's the book about? What did the author talk about? Did you like it? Was it good? Instead of doing that kind of a thing, what you're going to be doing is picking one limited, narrowed, specified topic and talking about it in great depth. And literary theory allows you to do that because it defines for you what that channel is going to be. All right. Now, I mentioned to you guys that literary theory is something that you've done before. It's actually something that you've been doing your whole life. So the first thing that I would tell you to think about is if I gave you a poem to read for, say, like AP practice, right? I put the poem in front of you. I very often give you very little to know about the poem other than maybe its title, maybe its author, maybe at most the year that it was published. And based off nothing other than the poem itself, I ask you to make some determination about what that poem means. If you've done that before, and all of you have done that before, congratulations, you've done literary theory before. The type of literary theory that you've done before, there's a name for it. It's called new criticism. You can see it up there. New criticism. New criticism really isn't that new. It's something that kind of came into literary vogue in the early 20th century. But before that, what people had been mostly doing with works of literature is reading works of literature as exemplars of moral behavior. So like if you read like Hamlet, like what does Hamlet teach us about being a better person? Well, I don't know. Maybe reading Hamlet can tell you about being a better person. It's like act boldly, make quick decisions, like that kind of. But like that's not really. It doesn't really tell you some of the deeper meanings, some of the broader implications of what that means. So around the early 20th century, this mode of literary criticism that you've been doing probably your whole life came into fashion. What this does is, again, this is very common. You've done it before. The text itself is the major focus. So you're not looking at outside forces. You're not looking at the biography. You're not looking at the history. You're not looking at any of that stuff. Instead, what you're looking at is the text and the text itself. So if I give you a poem, you're only looking at the poem. It is driven by close readings. Okay, so you focus on the words themselves, you focus on the imagery, diction, the sound of it, all of that stuff, and that's what you use to drive the analysis. You use all of that stuff and you come to some kind of deeper meaning, some better understanding of what that is. Okay, and this is called new criticism, and like I said, you've done it before, but you're not going to do it for this research paper. So what I want you to do is, if you're following along, taking notes on this, looking at this, what I want you to do is understand that new criticism, I just wanted to cover that with you so that you understand that you've done literary criticism before. You're not doing this particular criticism for your research paper. Instead, you're going to be trying something new. So I'm going to go through a couple of the new modes, some of the new things. When I say that they're new, though, I will point out to you, for your terms essays, you've been looking at a lot of the things that go into literary criticisms in your terms essays. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here when I'm reviewing some of these major literary theories for you will sound familiar. Okay, let's take this one, for example. New Historicism. New Historicism is a mode of literary interpretation that kind of came into fashion in the 1960s and 1970s. It was a response against new criticism. So you know how like with new criticism, you're looking at the text and you're only really looking at the text. New Historicism starts with the premise that like, well, that's one way that you can look at a work of literature, sure, but geez, when you remove all the historical context for a work of literature, you are missing a lot of the point of it, aren't you? I mean, you're kind of missing it, right? So new historicism, as I said, developed in the 1970s, and the idea here is that texts, works of literature, whatever it is that you're looking at, are expressions of historical events and cultural ideas. Every work of literature that comes from a time period tells you something about where it came from. So the work that you're actually doing with a new historicist approach is connecting that work of literature to its historical time period, to where it came from, right? Like, what is it saying about the time period in which it came? All texts in this become important. So if you remember our opening question at the beginning of the school year where I asked you guys, like, hey, is this literature? Is that literature? Right? Kept doing that over and over again. And I gave you guys the example about, a piece of graffiti being like scratched into the bathroom stall. It's like, is that literature? And I asked you, like, well, in 1,000 years, is it literature? Even if you thought that it did not have merit on its own, if you wait a long time and you look at it, is it literature? If we look at graffiti from like ancient Rome, is that literature? If we look at something that was like scratched under the side of a wall in ancient Egypt, does that become literature? Those hieroglyphics, like they might not have meant anything like really literary, but they might be important. So that's taking a new historicist approach. The new historicist is looking at everything from a time period as an expression of its historical moment. I'll give you a quick story here to demonstrate what I mean by the importance of a new historicist approach. I used to do Socratic seminars on elegies, poems about loss. There was one poem that I gave to my students, and it was called On the 99th Floor. Beautiful, incredibly heartbreaking poem, right? And my students came in and they were doing a Socratic discussion about it, and they were all excited to talk about it, and they get into their little semicircle in front of the class. You guys know that those awkward moments, right? And they start talking about it, and somebody starts with, well, I think the first thing that we should talk about when we start talking about this poem is the fact that it's about September the 11th, 2001. And there's another kid in the group who's just like, wait, what? Because they didn't realize that the date at the bottom that it was dated 2001, and they did not make the connection between the 99th floor and 2001 being about the fall of the World Trade Center in that time period. Could the student understand the poem, like something about the poem without knowing that? Sure, yeah, he got good stuff out of the poem, was able to look at the word choices, diction, stuff like that. But did he fully understand that poem without connecting it to its historical moment? No, probably not. So that's why new historicism might be a possible approach for you to consider when you're thinking about what you might ultimately want to say about the book that you chose for your senior research paper. And again, when I post this, if you have questions about any one of these approaches, let me know. Okay, like put a comment there. It might be good for the rest of the class. If you have something very specific or individual to your paper that you want to talk about, email me. Let me know. Hit me up. Okay, so that's new historicism. Feminism and sexual political readings of literature are built out of the new historicist model. The idea here is that all texts, and we're talking here about anything that you could call literature, so a book, a poem, a show, a cartoon, anything like that. All texts express ideas about what a society views or says about gender, sex, and sexuality. So, if you think about like a sitcom from like the 1950s, the roles that the husband and wife are portraying on that show are exemplars, models of what maybe 1950s society was trying to say about what is proper for men and women. The idea that these very gendered, very constructed roles are represented in that way is a focal point that you could look at and analyze sitcoms of the 1950s through that lens. So when you're taking on this kind of a perspective, you're looking at everything as an expression of what the society in question that created that work of literature at that point in time is saying about gender roles, sex, sexual roles, and like how they fit into society. That's sort of what the focal point here is. You can read a text for its representation of masculine ideas, feminine ideas, what is proper, what is radical, what's conservative, what's really out there. One thing that becomes very, very important in feminist and sexual political readings of work of literature is the idea of repression versus expression. This, simply put, means like certain kinds of characters in a work of literature have freedom. They can say things freely, they can act in certain kinds of ways, what we might call privileged kinds of ways, where like you can do a thing and you suffer no consequences for it. So like, if I, as a man in 1950s society, like I order my wife to make me dinner or something like that, like, and nobody's like, looking at me like, dude, what's your problem? It's telling you something about what's considered normal during that time period. And, consequently, when you're reading something from somebody who's maybe writing in a position of, not an empowered position in that society, you can get a sense of what that society allows and what they don't allow, what they will allow you to express freely and get away with, what they repress, what they're trying to clamp down on. Okay. You might not be able to see because of the weird little circle, but the word under here is patriarchy. Patriarchy is the idea that a society is constructed with power dynamics related to gender, and that these power dynamics have historically been related to male power and male privilege, and that societies have historically allowed men to be the power holders in a society. So that affects literature, right? If all men have access to legal rights and women don't, well, men can more freely express their ideas in literature while women can't. If all heterosexual people can freely express their ideas and have access to, like being able to be published, and publishers don't look at their ideas and be like, right? Then consequently, people who are gay might not be able to express their ideas as freely as all of that. Patriarchy is the idea that historically heterosexual men have held all legal rights and all power in society, and that has impacted what we will see in literature. So all of this to say that literature tends to be an expression of what a society allows, what it considers normal, what it allows like the most empowered people to say or do. But I don't want you to get the idea that like, I mean, there's literature out there that's very radical and will express to you ideas that would have been considered revolutionary at the time period in which it was written. Somebody, say, like a woman writer in the early 1800s, saying that women should not marry and that women should live on their own and be their own property. That doesn't sound very radical to us in 2020, but in 1820, that would have been considered very, very radical. So if that's a focal point, if that's something that you're interested in talking about, if there are elements of this kind of a reading that you consider to be interesting, this is something that you can focus on in your senior research paper while you're reading your book. If you look at the representations of men, women, heterosexuality, homosexuality, like all these different ideas, and you're seeing something in the book that speaks to you, and you're like, wow, it's actually kind of interesting. You can write about that. You don't have to write about like what is the theme of the entire thing, throughout history. I mean, you can focus on this one idea and talk about that one idea. So I think what I'm going to do, so that I'm not overwhelming you guys with all this stuff, is I'm going to break this up into a couple of parts. So let's consider this the end of part 1, and I will post subsequent parts either later today or maybe in a subsequent class period. Again, this is if we were in class and we were able to kind of like give and take and like live feed like that, like this gets more digestible. When it's really just me filibustering you via webcam for over 20 minutes, it's like that can be a lot. So I'm going to post this again. If you guys have any questions, let me know the questions that you're having. And I'm interested to hear kind of like what your take is on all of these. So when we get to this, I'm probably going to just post another discussion page for you guys to kind of sound off and talk about some possible approaches to the things that you're reading. We'll take a close look. Okay. See you all later. Bye-bye.